Hello and welcome to another Intro to Programming tutorial. In this tutorial we are going to continue to work on some of the ideas that I introduced to you in the last tutorial about if condition, flowcharting, and pseudocoding. Here we have a business problem that we are solving, which is to compare two numbers and then display the greater of the two numbers. Then we're going to be taking this example and we're going to be improving it in steps. Then we're going to be taking each of the steps and we're going to be writing the application on each of the steps. So to get started, we will going to right now accept two numbers from user, and in order to accept two numbers from user we got to declare the two variables that we're going to be holding these numbers. So we're going to be declare num1 and num2, and as we have learned in the past, all numbers and all variables must be preceded by the data type. That's how we do it in pseudocode. So I'm going to call these, let's say, double. These are numbers that could be decimal places. Now, we will going to prompt the user by writing a display and input combination. Enter number 1. Input num1. Enter number 2, input num2. Now, the business logic says display the greater of the two. So if that is the case, that means if number 1 is greater than number 2, then I'll say number 1 is greater. However, if number 1 is not greater than number 2, then number 2 is greater. Those are the two kind of options that we have. So if we were to write it in steps, the first step is that I'm going to check to see if number 1 is greater than number 2. So I'll say if number 1 is greater than number 2, then display number 1 is greater. However, that's an incomplete logic until and unless we write and if. And now that completes the block structure. However, the logic still has a flaw that if number 1 is not greater than number 2, then the program will simply sit there and will do nothing. Therefore, to avoid this situation, I'll simply take a copy of this code just so that we preserve both codes. So this is with if, and here we're going to write the else, or what we call otherwise. Else display num2 is greater. Now, one thing to notice, which is something that beginners do not necessarily notice until they make an error, but you don't have to make an error to understand this concept, and that is if has a condition. If condition, then. Else never has a condition. Because else pretty much means anything that is not true in accordance with if. Therefore, it does not need a condition. Anything that is not true by if will automatically fall to an else. So all that is not true by if will going to be else. However, even if this logic is considered, it has a flaw. And that flaw is, if number 1 is 5 and number 2 is 6, it's going to say yes, number 2 is greater. If number 1 is 6 and number 2 is 5, we'll say yes, number 1 is greater. But if number 1 and number 2 has the same values, then the if condition will fail because one value is not the greater than its own value. So 5 is not greater than 5. A value can't be greater than itself. However, the else will say number 2 is greater, but really the answer should be both numbers are same. In these kind of situations where we have more than two alternates, this is where we introduce the third type of an if condition, which is called if else if else. So what we have in this case is we have a condition. If number 1 is greater than number 2, yes, then number 1 is greater. Else if number 2 is greater than number 1, then number 1 is greater. No, number 2 is greater. If number 2 is greater than number 1, then number 2 is greater. If number 1 is greater than number 2, then number 1 is greater. So the first condition checks to see if number 1 is greater than number 2. Yes, number 1 is greater. If number 2 is greater than number 1, then yes, number 2 is greater. However, we have no condition to check if both come out to the same value. And since when we compare two numbers, there are only three possibilities. Either one number is greater than the other, or one number is less than the other, or one number is same as the other. Since that is the only condition left, we're going to put that under else. Else display number 1 is equal to number 2. So this is how you go about writing if, else, these three sets of conditions. So now that completes the pseudocode writing for if else, else. Next, we're going to take this idea and we're going to transform this into a console-based application. So let me grab the pseudocode right from here so that I can easily translate it into an equivalent console-based application. So here I am at the console-based application. I am creating a project. It's a VB console application. It'll going to open up Microsoft Visual Basic console application, and we're going to give me a main module to work with. And this is exactly where I'm going to be writing my code between the main module. So of course it's going to give me errors because these are all pseudocode, and of course any of the pseudocode words that are used in VB are automatically highlighted in blue color. Now this is a shortcut that I could use in Microsoft Visual Basic .NET environment. After selecting all the lines that I want to comment, right on the toolbar I have this option called comment out the selected line. So I can click this and all the lines that I've selected will turn into a comment. Of course I missed this line, so I can go back to this line, and then I'd not had it selected. I just simply went to that line and pressed that button, and then it automatically changes that into a comment as well. So now we will going to divide up this logic such that we can be writing our VB code. Now let me fix this. It adds this parentheses. Let me get rid of the parentheses so that it looks exactly like the way we wrote our pseudocode. So now, declare, as we know, gets translated into dim num1, num2 as double. Now the display statement's equivalent is system.console.write, remember, because we do not want to display the insertion point on the next line. Enter number 1. And then on the next line, we will going to take the input for number 1 by converting that input into a double data type, system.console.readLine. This is something that we have done in the last week and probably the week before last week. So let's grab these two lines and we will going to copy and paste them right below. Then I'm going to be making changes into my variable. Wherever it says enter number 1 or wherever it says number 1, I'm going to change that to number 2. So here it is the input for number 2. Now I will going to write my if condition in Microsoft Visual Basic. Now Microsoft Visual Basic if condition is so close to that of the pseudocode, it's unbelievable. The only change that you will really going to be making to this if condition is wherever you see the display, it's going to be replaced with system.console.writeLine. That's it. Otherwise, the rest of the code will going to translate as it is. So I will going to simply copy these comment lines and paste it right below. And you will notice how less of a code I would have to write. First, let me uncomment this whole block. So I am selecting this whole block. And right next to this button where I click to comment, there is a button to the right of that that says uncomment. So uncomment these lines. And I'm going to start making changes. Instead of the word display, I'm going to write system.console.writeLine. And I'm going to start and end my parentheses. I'm going to take this, I'll go down here, do the same thing. I'll come down here and replace the display with system.console.writeLine and just close the parentheses on both sides. And you'll notice that just by making the changes to the display command, not even the whole instruction, to system.console.writeLine, now we have the code in VB. Now let's run this. So Control F5 is the shortcut. And we can always go into debug and start without debugging. Now, one of the things that I've noticed that had come across in last week's lab, that if you have to ever make a change, you have to make sure that your program is not running. How do you make sure? Well, when your program is running, you will going to see some kind of an output here. And in some cases, you may see over here a stop button or something like that. And if you can look at your status bar down below, you will going to notice that there will going to be some kind of a window open that is not one of the software that you may recognize. So those are some indicators that your console environment or your GUI environment are running. So now here, let's go back here. So enter number 1. So we're going to enter a number for number 1. I'm entering 4. Enter number 2. I'm entering 6. And here it comes back and say number 2 is greater. Of course, 6 is greater than 4. Let me try to run this again. So here I am at number 1. I'm going to enter 100.4. And for number 2, I'm going to enter 100.39. And then it comes back and say number 1 is greater, which is exactly the case. 100.4 is greater than 100.39. Now let's do a third check here. I would like to compare to see -2, is that greater than -2? And it says no, number 1 is equals to number 2. A -2 is same as a -2. So we were able to test with whole numbers, positive whole numbers, negative whole numbers, and decimal for each one of the 3 cases where number 1 was greater or number 2 was greater or they were the same numbers. So this is how you can be converting your pseudocode into an equivalent console application. So that basically was the whole transition. Now let's take this whole idea and try to take this to an extent of writing a graphical user interface. What I'm going to do is I have this whole VB code over here. I'll just grab this VB code along with all the pseudocode that I have, whatever I have inside the main, between the opening and closing of the main. So here we have submain, we have an end sub. Between this, I'll copy this code. I'm going to be needing a lot of this code in my GUI environment, and I don't want to rewrite it again. So I'm going to click File, New Project. Now, of course, you don't have to create a console and a GUI. I'm just trying to show you with these examples so that you know how things can be done in both environments. So here I have my if else number example. Now, first of all, I'm going to be designing my form here. So in my form, I will going to be bringing 2 labels, one for number 1, one for number 2. Then I'm going to be needing a label for my output. Then I'm going to be needing 3 text boxes, one for number 1, one for number 2, and one for the output. And then I'm going to be needing a button, and my entire logic will going to go on the button. So when I am done designing, I'll double click on the button. And when I double click on the button, my code should go in the button. My code should not go in the form load. My code should not go in any other event but on the button. So I'm going to be bringing in the labels first. So here I have label 1. And I'm going to then bring in the label 2. Then I'm going to bring in the label 3. Then I will going to bring in the text boxes. So here is my first text box. Here's my second text box. And here's my third text box. Then I'm going to be bringing in my button. So here is my button. Now let me add certain information, some information here to each one of these form elements. Let me change the properties. So as usual, I will going to be changing the font properties so that it is a little bit larger than what it is right now, so that it's a little bit more readable. So I'm changing it to size 12. Okay, my label number 1. Now I'm going to be now notice if you by mistake double click on any of the components, it just add all the stuff. Make sure you don't delete everything. You only need to delete these extra lines, which is a label 1 click event. I'm not working with label 1. I'm only going to be working with the button. So any of these extra things must go away. So these are the two tabs. I can switch back and forth between the design view and the code view. So I'm back to the design view. So in my label, I'm going to be clicking the text and say, okay, enter number 1. I'll click on the second label and I'll say enter number 2. Okay, now here I have the text item that says, okay, what is the result? Now the result could be longer, like for example, number 1 is greater than number 2, or they're equal, so that could go longer. So that's why I'm making a longer text box for my result. Now, as far as my button is concerned, then say, okay, find greater or equal. Okay, so that's basically the text that I want to write here, find greater or equal. So, once again, I can very easily bring in my text from my GUI, from my console application, and I could paste it here without any problem. But just so that you could see it again, let's say if you only had to work with the GUI environment. So let me double click on the button first. So here I am in the button. And notice very clearly here that I am going to write my event on button 1 underscore click. Now why button 1 underscore click? Because that's what my button's name is. So whatever is the name of your button, here the name of my button is button 1. Whatever is the name of your button, that's exactly what the event will be under. So you have to make sure that if you have a button, then the code must be going in the button that belongs to button. So let me come back to my PowerPoint here. Let me grab this code and let me paste it here. Then I'm going to be commenting all of this code just like exactly the same way I commented before. This is the same option. I click and here I go. My code goes commented. So now let me decrease the size of these site panes so that I could utilize the maximum amount of space for writing my code. Well, of course, I can be fixing by removing these parentheses, which are added by Visual Basic. Okay, so now let's write the equivalent code in VB. So the declare gets converted to dim. Then I have two variables as double. That stuff remains exactly the same. Now, the only difference is your display and input are now being replaced with a label and a text box. So now you have to say, okay, number 1, instead of receiving an input from the console through system.console.readline, is rather now accepting or its input from a text box. So I did not change the names of my text box. So I still have text box 1, which is my text button, and then I have text box 2. You have to make sure that the names are changed before you start the code. Otherwise, everything will going to be messed up. If you go and change the name later on, VB does not automatically fixes the names. So we're going to be giving you a lot of errors saying by referring to the old name that I am not able to find these objects. So you have to be careful over here. So now I have my input in my two variables, num1 and num2. Now exactly like before, I'm going to take these lines, I'll copy them, and I'll paste them right below, and I'm going to uncomment these by using the same option in the toolbar, a little call out button with a red X. And now instead of saying display, my display is actually going in a text box. So I'll say text box 3.text equals to number 1 is greater. Text box 3.text equals to this is greater, and then that is greater. Okay, so now number 1 is equal to number 2. So now let's go back to the form again just to check to see if we have got all these objects in the right places. And here I can say, okay, this is text box 1, this is text box 2, and this is text box 3. So as I'm selecting, I can see their names. So going back to the form code, now this is how the logic works. We have two variables. Each one of the variables get an input from the text boxes. So text box 1's input is in number 1, text box 2's input is in number 2. Now we have an if condition which checks to see that which one of the following is a valid input. So if number 1 is greater than number 2, then of course number 1 is greater. That should be displayed in the text box 3. If number 2 is greater than number 1, then of course number 2 is greater. So that's the message that should be displayed in the text box. And if they're same, then it should say number 1 is equals to number 2. Now let's try to run this program the way we have built it. So let's say if I enter for number 1 45, and I enter 44 for number 2, it says, well, number 1 is greater. Of course number 1 is greater. But if I drop this to 43, then I'll say, well, number 2 is greater. But if I make them both the same values, it'll say, well, they're both the same. Number 1 is equal to number 2. So here we were able to successfully take that pseudocode and convert it into a graphical user interface with the minimum amount of work. Hope you would have enjoyed this tutorial. Catch you in the next one.